right, good morning. Go ahead and get started if everybody's here, and if you're not here. This is Amateur Radio 101, Ham Radio 101. My name is Brandon Curnette. Amateur call sign KE8KNX. That doesn't stand for anything. That's sequentially assigned by the FCC. The next person is KE8KNY. And if you think real hard, you can figure out the one after that. Vanity call signs are available for, if it's available. What is ham radio or amateur radio? First off, ham was a pejorative term used in professional wired telegraphy. During the 19th century to mock operators with poor Morse code sending skills. Ham's not an acronym, it doesn't stand for anything, it's just a ham-fisted Morse code operator. Amateur radio is the use of radio frequency spectrum for the purposes of non-commercial exchange of messages, wireless experimentation, self-training, private recreation, radio sports, contesting, and emergency communication. That is the FCC official definition, which every country has their own equivalent of the FCC and may vary slightly. This is a sport or hobby of radio frequency in relation to amateur radio. It's the oscillation rate of an alternating electric current, which energy from an oscillating current can radiate off a conductor into space as radio waves. Some of us are technical people, even network engineers, familiar with the term crosstalk. Signals bouncing off of Cat 5, Cat 6, etc. into others and causing interference. That is unintentional radiation. This is intentional radiation. If you look at the diagram here, it is kind of set up the way that we want it to radiate at the end of the conductor, off the antenna, so it hits a certain amount of electrical pressure and it will radiate from the antenna instead of reflecting back and tearing up your equipment, which standing wave ratio, that's a whole nother discussion. There's some basic animations of how these things kind of radiate in perfect conditions, which are nearly impossible, but antenna modeling is also another rabbit hole to dig deep into. Basic graph of that oscillation. When we say oscillation, that is the frequency that it changes from positive to negative and back in 1 second. So we'll say the 20 megahertz band. You'll hear this often in our field, the 2.4 to 5 gigahertz band. That means it's changing from positive to negative and back in 5 billion times a second. We'll say terms like wavelength. You look at the top of this image, that is the distance between the peaks. We'll say the 2 meter band. That means when this changes from positive to negative, the distance between those wavelengths is 2 meters. You'll see the 80 meter band or 160 meter band. It means the wavelength, if you could see it radiating through space, it's 160 meters from peak to peak there. If you're good at basic antennas, half a wavelength, then your basic antenna would be 80 meters long for that. So imagine the backyards in a homeowners association would have something to say about that. Quick look at the types of electromagnetic radiation. As the frequency gets higher and higher, it has different uses. Off to the left of this one, it's kind of what we use in amateur radio, the lower frequencies, television, commercial radio. As the frequencies get higher into called microwaves because they're so close together. I mean, your cell phones, your microwaves, they're in the thousands and millions of oscillations per second, or hertz. And then further along, visible light, ultraviolet light, gamma rays, those are in the quadrillions of a second if you could measure it. Quick look at the radio frequency chart. This is most of the lower frequencies. Almost all of the radio frequency available is being used somewhere. You'll see it just on this one. Here's your the FM broadcast just on your radios out in your car, sandwiched in between aircraft frequencies and television channels. They're called channels because if you look at this long band, it's just a channel cut in that frequency. TV channel 3 is using all of that in between it. So you'll be hard pressed to find anything that's not occupied through here. And here's some of the frequencies or bands used by amateur radio. There's a little bit of amateur radio space in almost every section of the radio frequency chart. This is an older one, so there's some of these aren't, and they've changed a little bit, and there's not a novice license any longer. But I'd already made the slideshow, and I'm not going to change it. Maybe next year. All right, we used the term earlier, non-commercial. Think about terrestrial radio, your AM, FM stations going out into your car. Satellite services, something like DirecTV, XM radio, now satellite internet. Those are all. There are satellite options in amateur radio, but they're not commercial like that. Business two-way communication, think like tow trucks, even police and fire bands. Those are all separate sections of the radio frequency chart and all licensed differently. Even your cell phones are UHF transceivers, not too different from any of the little radios sitting around. They're just different power, different settings, different licensing, things like that. And in the definition was wireless experimentation. There's always new stuff going on. This image is a picture of a application called Weak Signal Propagation Reporter. It is a globally somewhat linked application where there are, you take turns to broadcast a low power signal, and different receivers from all around the world will pick it up and then report on an image like this of what they heard, where they heard it, what time, so you can kind of see where your signal may or may not be going around the world. And this is something that you can look at without a license, but you can't really transmit on it. This is an application to test antennas. Like I said earlier, we want to get ideal situations, but it's not always possible in homeowners associations or even on the roof of your car. Doing the best you can. This will get you at least an idea of how well your antenna is going to perform, but antenna engineering is an entire profession almost on its own. This will at least give you a place to start. Digital modes are getting more and more popular. It's not just people sitting around in front of a microphone all the time. $10 points, anybody can guess what that said. Secure WV in Morse code. It's still around, still out there. There's several different ways to just kind of listen around, USB devices that'll hook to an antenna, or something called a web SDR, software-defined radio. That's just somebody's transceiver they put on the internet, and anybody can tune around and listen. A lot of people still use Morse code because the bandwidth being used is just razor thin, so you can punch through busy traffic or bounce it around the atmosphere, and it's really easy. Instead of a human trying to discern a voice, you can just listen to the tones and get through it. It's one of the things I've not learned very well yet, but we're still working on it. Even old radio teletype is still around, using old gear that people are finding in basements, warehouses. But you can also just do radio teletype on a computer with the same application you see up here. I'll do a quick little demonstration on it shortly. And private recreation, it is mostly a solo activity, sitting in we call a ham shack, kind of like on the picture here. Everybody's different, or just a laptop out in the woods of a park, trying to get contacts anywhere and everywhere. Experimenting with different technologies, even inventing new ones, happens all the time. New antennas, new digital modes, new radios, and trying to make global contacts with simple equipment. Radio sport, this is a picture of what they call a D-expedition, a distance transmitting expedition. Remote islands, distant countries, they'll put out in magazines and online forums that they're going to this island. Like I had a friend that went to Midway Island several years ago. I was like, you're going to take a little ham radio set up and it'll be flooded with postcards eventually, because it's just one of those things that it's hard to get to. Nobody takes the radio. And if you can get a postcard from Midway Island or the Vatican, North Korea, that's one of those things that it's super rare. People travel all around the world just to do these kinds of things. Summit on the Air is hiking to the summit of mountains. I don't know if there's a contact for Mount Everest, but people do hike to the peak of mountains with their basic radio gear and try to make contacts up there. And all kinds of cool things. Contesting, a lot of ham radio folks like to do this. All manner of frequencies, transmission modes, voice, digital, slow scan television, where you're just transmitting images out into the airwaves. You just sit around and receiving memes over the airwaves for free. It's crazy the things these people come up with, attach their call signs with, and then send it out into the world. Emergency communication, that's kind of what got me into it. There's several different organizations that kind of link together and practice these kinds of things. Amateur radio emergency service areas, that's nationwide, and local groups that get together and practice emergency communications. The radio amateur civil service, it's linked to FEMA, so they can maintain communications in the event of catastrophic events. And MARS, that's the interface between the military and amateur radio. All these things have groups that link up, practice, and do disaster testing. Several examples. September 11th, 2001 attacks, the repeater for the New York emergency management was on top of one of the towers. So when it went down, the communication was crippled, and amateur radio operators in New York City provided a lot of functions for police, fire, EMS, all the emergency management. Same with Hurricane Katrina. I mean, the power's gone, then your radio repeaters are gone. You can't even charge your handheld radios. And even recently this year, Hurricane Helene, there was a radio repeater tower in North Carolina that was transmitting status reports and wellness checks. They had that tower connected to the radio, or to the internet, so people could just tune in and listen to get any kind of updates that they could, because no power, no cell phones, nothing. You know, amateur radio operators are always willing to step up. So why do this in the first place? It's good for geeks, I think. It is electronics, buying, testing, building, soldering, experimenting. It's showing off. Just a fun way to use your computer in a new way. Using brand new stuff or ancient 50-pound radios the size of a cinder block and way more that you're trying to tune with vacuum tubes. I've got 2 of those that still work, kind of, and it's just neat to see the tubes warm up, and it's just this weak little thing compared to something you get for 20 bucks on the internet. A little something for everyone. Digital modes with your computer. You don't need to sit in front of a microphone at all and talk to people, which some of those in our field, that sounds very appealing. No arguing with little knobs. It's all computer controlled. You can do cool things like pick up transmissions from weather satellites, NASA information. They're all their satellites, telescopes, sensors, everything are just sending radio signals back to Earth. And with the right equipment, the right software, you can pick it up and read it just the same as they can. And even the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, their big network, they're always trying to get more computing power and antennas to listen to whatever they can pick up. For those of us that like competition, doing capture the flag type things, there's always a contest running. Low power, fill the grid, make contacts with every state, every county, all the state capitals, something like that. If anybody's interested in that, the American Radio Relay League magazine is the best place for that. They have a digital version of that, so you don't have a physical magazine. And even trying to use international contacts using 5 watts. That one's getting pretty popular as these transceivers are getting smaller and smaller. The big thing is lugging around the battery, but even those are getting smaller. So, emergencies we talked about earlier. Cell phones are often unreliable. Remember the 2012 derecho? Power was spotty, but the cell phones were just overwhelmed. The towers were overwhelmed, and it would take 5-10 minutes just to. I remember checking the AEP website to see if anything had changed. The internet infrastructure is vulnerable. How many people have heard of a fiber cut in another state and your stuff here has gone down? It doesn't take much. One wayward, excavator can take out internet for a lot of people. And the plain old telephone service is declining. Anybody still have a home line? No, who's DSL? Even as a backup for work. See, that was Old Faithful for a long time, but now it's declining. Same with cable now, the coax. It's going in favor of fiber, which is easier to break and harder to fix. Where do you see hams, amateur radio operators? Groups of like-minded individuals. Several hams associated with this conference, a couple in the room. Hard-pressed to find a survivalist without a handheld, at least a receiver, to listen to any information they can pick up. And almost all military veterans use communication in some form or another, either a giant Singars radio or a tiny little handheld. Communication was key in almost all military operations. That's one of the things that got me really interested in radio, was a high-frequency radio that would transmit data over the horizon, bounce off the ionosphere, send GPS position reports, just the push of a button. No satellites, no cables, nothing. Conferences like this, different hams talking, looking around, you'll see little antennas poking out of the top of people's bags, whether they're staff or not. We just kind of lug them around. Lots of online forums, Facebook groups, Slack, Discord. Reddit is a huge amateur radio community for any kind of information you'd want. Some clubs, local radio clubs host testing. We used to do testing here before COVID, and then that kind of stopped. A lot of first responders are either attached to amateur radio operators or amateur radio operators themselves as a method of backup communication. Lessons learned from, a big one was September 11th. I know both local metro and the CAMC Medbase, they had several amateur radio operators after September 11th because if one of the local towers goes down, then they've lost communication with ambulances out in the field, helicopters, fixed wings incoming, even other local helicopters to share resources. If you've got a transceiver and an antenna, you can at least communicate with somebody. And even in fiction, you see lots of uses of amateur radio, CB radio, any kind of communication they can come up with. World War Z, the book, not the movie, and The Stand, they use CB radios to communicate with folks coming in, going out of Boulder or the free zone, because there's no infrastructure. If you can find a car battery or something lugging around to power your radio, then at least you can transmit. And bare minimum receive to get information. So how do you get started? First thing is licensing. Anybody can buy any of this equipment and listen. I even use some of the stuff online, but you do need a license to transmit. There are FCC volunteers who will find you, catch you, report you, allegedly. That might just be a myth, but either way, I mean, something like this isn't going to transmit beyond the ridge line here, so if you've got a little 2-watt transmitter, you might be okay, but still you're supposed to have a license to transmit. There's 3 levels. Technician is the entry level, basic operating privileges, the longest possible call sign that they could give you, and then the general license is the second tier. That was more high frequency privileges, more digital mode privileges. That's where I am. I've not gone for the amateur extra yet. They get the shortest possible availability for vanity call signs and a little bit of extra frequency space, so there's not as much noise. The amateur extra bands have less noise. Way to get started is self-study. American Radio Relay League puts out very good books on this. My favorite was Ham Radio for Dummies. That was my first dip of the toe into this hobby. And mobile apps for testing. That was really helpful for me because FCC does the testing, so it's all public information. All the test answers and questions are out there, but there's hundreds of them, so you never know what you're going to get, but it's an easy way to test your knowledge with a mobile app. Just test, test, test. Cram sessions at club functions, they will read out every test question with the answer 2 or 3 times and then test you immediately, so it's all fresh, which is perfectly legal. That's one way to at least get started. Professional courses available online, paid or otherwise, if you want somebody to teach you these things. It's helpful if that's your preferred method of learning. Some of the stuff can get a little dry. You get into voltages and standing wave ratios, and you might nod off reading a book. Or YouTube with could have a combination of all of those, which is of course a free resource if you're dedicating the ad time. Self-training, that was my preferred. Hamfest was a local activity, just hams gathering to do testing, studying, swap meets, trading equipment. Those all have Facebook groups, forum posts. They're blasted all over Reddit, trying to get everybody in there to buy their used stuff so they can spend it again. Club gatherings. One of the local teams will go out to Canal State Forest, local park for those that aren't from around here. Throw up their big antennas up in the trees and just host a public event to show off what ham radio can do. I mean, sitting making international contacts just from the place where we go to ride bikes. It's kind of neat just to show everybody what we do. Frequent nets, those are just groups online where we agree to meet at a certain frequency, certain time to discuss whatever the topic of the day is. Fun one for that is on Christmas Eve. They'll have somebody that pretends to be Santa Claus, and they'll let your kids, transmit, hey, I want a new bike, and Santa will say, okay, we'll get that right for you. That's one fun thing to do with a net. And Jamboree on the Air, one of my favorites. That's a scouting-related activity that scouts from all over the country, all over the world, trying to make amateur radio contacts at the same time. Getting actually on the air, real commonplace people are starting with these cheap handheld transmitters, the infamous Bofang. This is a UV8R, not the 5R, a little more transmitter power. The regulations have changed on these recently. On this one, if you can type it in, you can transmit on it, which is an FCC no-no, because something like the little Luigi radio up here, that's just a family radio service transceiver. It's UHF, it's locked into that frequency, those channels. You can't change the antennas or anything like that. But technically I can transmit from this. So some of the imported radios are out of compliance. Some will say illegal. Read into that what you want. Mobile units like the little guy on the end, I really get that set up. Plugs into your car, connect to a better radio, higher transmit power, a little more functionality, but it's mobile, and they're often good enough to be a base station. My base station 2-meter or VHF transceiver at home is just a mobile unit that I've parked. And even the larger base stations reach the limits of frequency capabilities. The highest transmitted power I know of is 1,500 watts, which is, I think it's the max you can gather from a 20 amp circuit in your house. So I don't think you can gather more electricity to transmit from that. But if there's any locals around here driving through the interstate or over the Dunbar Bridge, you see up on the ridge, there's a lot of towers that don't look like cell phone towers. That's somebody's amateur radio setup. I mean, it's an enormous tower setup with rotating antennas. You can go from this little guy here to thousands and thousands of dollars of equipment that look like that. And everything in between. Really, I've just got a wire antenna out in my backyard, and it's make the same contacts. Equipment, you get what you pay for. You can do a complete software-defined radio setup that it's all filtered through a computer, or what they call boat anchors. What I mentioned before, the size and weight of a cinder block, but it's old equipment. I mean, as they say, the vinyls and the tube speakers sound better. It does have a unique setup for it, and a $10,000 ICOM and a $50 boat anchor you find at a yard sale, and again, everything in between. There's just so much. We could talk about equipment all day. And antennas, they're from a little rubber duck like this to a $20,000 tower setup with amplifiers and tower rotators on it to point all over the world. It could be as simple as a wire. It's called a J-pole. I should have an image of that. Those are easy to make, fun to do. And hidden antennas. I brought up homeowners associations a few times. That's a common topic on Reddit, is how to hide antennas. I know a guy that claims he tuned his gutters and made just his whole gutter system an antenna.
My dad did that.
If you got to hide stealth antennas, it's its own topic. It could go for 2 hours on that one. It's just neat the way these people generate ways to bypass their HOA. Put a big pole and then a birdhouse on top of it and hope something endangered comes into it. That way they can't do anything about it. Places to get started and more resources. Like I said before, Ham Radio for Dummies is where I got started. They make it easy to read for the lay person. I did a little bit of work in RF when I was in the Army, and some in the IT field, so I mean wavelengths, bandwidth, that kind of thing. Easy for me to grasp, but Ham Radio for Dummies makes it easier. A lot of cool stuff on Pinterest, a lot of things that people make. If you're a maker, a DIY person, then Pinterest was a good resource that surprised me. YouTube, for all things. Dave Kassler, call sign KE0OG, he does a lot of courses on getting licensed. He does a Ask Dave series that's up to, I think, 300. Just anything you'd want to know about amateur radio, he's the one to look up on YouTube, or at least a place to start. The ARRL, American Radio Relay League exam manuals, those are probably the best if you're interested in get licensed. And the QST magazine put out by the Radio Relay League, monthly publication, both paper and digital. It's mostly ads, but there's a lot of cool resources in there. They're always showing the contests that are upcoming, some project that you can build. Several things that I've got I built from instructions from the magazine. And there's almost always an article about a de-expedition, some remote country. I read about one, they took the radio gear to Antarctica just to make contacts. I mean, you can say they got a postcard from Antarctica. That's all I've got for the show. If we've got, plenty of time. Do a quick demonstration. Did that time out? It did not. So this is an application. It did not switch. Hold on, let me stop presenting. Look at that. There we go. This is a free application called FL Digi. I think I'm saying that right. It's available on all operating systems. There's a mobile version. It's basically a keyboard-to-keyboard amateur radio application. You can type, anything. Is that visible? Can you see that? Looks super small here. And then when you push play, transmit it. Anybody hear that? That is repeating. There we go. I broke it. Either way, that's a digital mode if you were to listen to it, but the computers can communicate with that back and forth. The bandwidth is razor thin, so just like the Morse code, or they're called continuous wave, CW, it's a lot easier to transmit that and bounce it off the ionosphere, break through heavy radio traffic if there's a contest going on. And these digital modes are being set up and programmed all the time. That's all I've got. Any questions, comments, concerns? Sir?
Can you explain how this wavelength distance, like, what exactly does that entail? Like if one wave is spread out farther than the other, what difference does that make?
The difference mainly is one of them is the antenna size, because this is technically a half chiseled down half wave. Every antenna is a dipole. It's two poles, positive, negative, like we did in the. I can bring it back up. What are we doing? That's up there. You can see it. Turn it to the side. Half of it's this way, half of it goes out this way. This is an addition I added onto it, but it's the same length. This antenna's coiled up, so we're talking about the wavelengths. So we'll want it to go in at the same distance that it's transmitting. So this could pick up part of a lower frequency, but I mean, if it's 80 meters long, going back and forth oscillating, it's not really going to pick it up, and if it does, it would be unusable. So antenna size is one of the biggest ones, and the power levels are part of that as well. So when it's oscillating faster, that's the power levels changing from positive to negative at different speeds. It's the electrical engineer would explain that better than I can. That's about the extent of my knowledge on that.
It also affects transmission distance.
Distance.
Lower frequency, just like sound, lower frequency radio waves travel farther than higher frequency.
An amateur radio, the higher frequencies, this one is set to 146.5 megahertz. If it goes out into the sky, it'll just blast right through it, out into space forever, according to electrical theory. And the lower frequencies into 5 and 6 megahertz will get absorbed by layers of the sky, so they won't go anywhere. But some of them are just right where they will literally bounce off parts of the atmosphere, the ionosphere, and then back down to the ground and then back up again, so you can skip it across all over the world. Most I've done is a few hundred miles, but even then that was over the line of sight, 2 or 3 different skips around the world. And then part of that is studying the sun cycles. There was a, what was the big sunspot thing a few weeks ago that charged the particles in the atmosphere, and amateur radio went crazy over it. Even looking at the timing in the evening when the sun's hitting the earth at a different angle, it's charging the particles in a different way. So you'll see the bands pick up and hear more traffic, and you'll transmit a lot farther in the evenings. So, and just watching the different frequencies and how they interact with the ionosphere is a whole nother talk on its own. There's so many rabbit holes down in amateur radio. I mean, I've been at it for 10 years now and still learning new stuff. A little something for everybody. Anybody else? Thanks for coming out Saturday morning.